very pleased to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I apologize that I've missed a lot of the discussion because of the time difference. So my project today is to try to suggest new ways to understand what the concept of socialism could mean. And there are essentially three reasons for that. One is the need to distance ourselves from the negative experiences of authoritarian socialism in the 20th century. The second is the need to unify the plural set of social movements that are part of the contemporary left in most parts of the world. And the third is the need to facilitate some kind of cooperation between revolutionaries and reformers. That the argument is that in previous centuries, the left had the greatest strength when there was at least some form of tacit cooperation between those two groups. So I want to do this by exploiting the concept of habitation that Karl Polanyi elaborates in The Great Transformation. He talks about the conflict between habitation and improvement, particularly in his chapter on the enclosures. And the idea is that the enclosures represented economic improvement. They made possible significant advances in agricultural productivity. But Polanyi argues that this came at the expense of rural habitation, that there was a significant destruction of the living standard of rural people who had come to depend upon the commons to graze their animals and to do other things which were possible in the era before the enclosures. So Polanyi is positing a fundamental conflict between improvement, economic advance, and the protection of the communities in which people live. And I would argue that this pattern of economic improvement coming at the expense of habitation is repeated endlessly as working people find their communities destroyed by capitalist development. And that part of their struggle is the struggle to maintain some semblance of habitation, some kind of decent community within which to live. And now, obviously, with climate change, our entire planetary habitation is under threat. But the complexity, the paradox, is that in most developed societies and even in many developing societies, both the agricultural and the industrial labor forces have been declining, and that most people now in the developed countries work at jobs that involve creating and maintaining habitation. And so what I have in mind here is that people who work in construction, people who work in health services, in education services, in other social services, those essential workers during COVID who stocked the grocery stores and maintained the basic infrastructure, the people who work in transportation and communication and local government. And so if you do the arithmetic, you find that some very substantial, more than a majority, maybe 60, 70% of the labor force are actually engaged in maintaining, repairing, rebuilding the social and physical infrastructure of the communities in which we live. So I'm positing that kind of we can think of agricultural society, industrial society, and then habitation society, in that this becomes the dominant economic activity. But the paradox of a transition to a habitation society operating under the auspices of capitalism, or whatever we want to call it, is that there's this deep paradox that most people are producing habitation and we're all consuming habitation in both rural and urban and suburban communities. But we do not control the habitation that we're producing, the habitation that we're consuming, that we essentially get the habitation that business and government choose to give us. And that if you kind of think across the terrain of our lives, this is a deep problem. And I mean, it's most obvious in the kind of crises of urban living that are characteristic and that are particularly acute in the United States, you know, where affordable housing is increasingly difficult to find. The homeless encampments are growing everywhere. That these are the kind of symptoms of our inability to control the habitation that we ourselves are producing and consuming. So what I'm proposing, suggesting, is that we can understand what socialism would mean in our own epoch. It should be understood as the movement to democratically create habitation that is sustainable, inclusive, and egalitarian. And I guess to try to connect more explicitly with the other contributions to this panel, I would argue that the kind of classical debates around the feasibility of socialism and how to manage the issue of production, those issues are very different at this point in time, in part because the kind of knowledge of how to organize industrial production factories to make them productive is now a kind of widely available knowledge, but that that habitation, how to produce healthcare that meets people's needs, how to produce an education system that meets people's needs, these are so obviously subject or areas where democratization is a kind of unproblematic concept, because the mysteries of production are not that great. The people who are producing the habitation already have extensive knowledge, and working with consumers have the capacity to figure out how to manage the task of a more rational system of production. So let me suggest some of the advantages of this particular formulation, this kind of heterodox way of thinking about socialism. The first is that the different movements that are particularly visible in many developed countries, environmental movements, anti-racist movements, feminist movements to expand care, movements for affordable housing, for workers' rights, union workers' movements, that all of these different movements could potentially be persuaded to understand that their unifying element of their demands is the creation of democratic and sustainable habitation. I mean, that part of the contemporary problem is that socialism is an abstract concept, whereas habitation has the potential to be a much more concrete, especially as the as the climate crisis bears down on us. The second issue is that I think that the work of my late colleague Eric Olin Wright is particularly fruitful in arguing that our path to socialism at this point in time requires four kind of complementary strategies for eroding capitalism. He talked about the need to tame capitalism through regulation and progressive taxation, to contest capitalism through unions and community struggles, to escape capitalism via new arrangements such as cooperatives, and finally, to dismantle capitalism by structural reforms, such as the reorganization of the financial system to take power away from private capital. And it seems to me that the concept of democratizing habitation has the potential for different groups of people, different movements that, I mean, the kind of tension that's implicit in Wright's work is that the people who are trying to tame capitalism and the people who are trying to dismantle capitalism can kind of fall out with each other and be engaged in sectarian battles with each other, rather than recognizing that they're engaging in a common struggle to erode the power of capital. And it seems to me that the notion of democratizing and creating an inclusive and sustainable habitation has the potential to provide a language that those groups pursuing different aspects of the Wrightian strategy can come to see. Thirdly, the notion of democratizing habitation protects us from the quick fix. I mean, we know that advancing to some meaningful form of socialism is not going to happen overnight. It is going to be a long process. And when we think about democratizing habitation, it is a project that would unfold over a long period of time. Yet at the same time, I'm suggesting that the concept of democratizing habitation has the potential, is capacious enough to support both more radical and more reformist visions of what human emancipation might look like. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.